Welcome to Tech Uncensored. Hi, everyone. My name is Hetty Jones. Early February of this year, Donald Trump imposed significant tariffs on Canadian imports. Effective February 4th, these tariffs included 25% duty on general goods, 10% duty on the energy resources coming from Canada. The stated rationale was to pressure Canada to actually enhance border security and curb these illegal drug flows into the US. This we know now is a red herring. So the implementation of these proposed tariffs has been subject to multiple delays and threats of retaliation in the midst of negotiations between Canadian and US officials. On March 4th, the US tariffs were finally enforced, and simultaneously, Canada's first phase of retaliatory tariffs of 25% on $30 billion worth of American imports into Canada had actually taken effect. But 2 days later, March 6th, Trump announced a delay on tariffs on goods compliant with the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement until April 2nd. And this move was actually in response from the pressure of the CEOs of Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, who told the president of their grave concerns of tariffs on the auto sector. So throughout February and March of this year, there has been this cycle of continuous threats and counter threats that persisted between the two countries when it comes to these tariffs. So April 2nd, it's around the corner, and several significant events are expected to occur on this ongoing trade war between Canada and the US. On this day, the US tariffs on Canadian goods, which were partially paused on March 6th, are expected to fully resume. So that's the 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada and 10% on the energy products. These will be fully implemented. At the same time, Canada's second wave of retaliatory tariffs are expected to take effect. And so this is the 25% tariffs on the $125 billion worth of US origin goods imported into Canada. And finally, the temporary exemption for Canadian goods that were compliant with the Canadian-US-Mexico trade agreement, which began on March 7th, will be set to expire. So all of this has had reverberations across the Canadian business sector. Some of the business impacts are already being felt. I'm going to give you a few stats that I've sourced. 69% of businesses have experienced higher costs and supply chain issues. Half of businesses surveyed are already thinking about switching suppliers that are less affected by the tariffs. 25% of businesses indicated that they've already lost market share, and 41% of businesses reported decreased competitiveness and demand. One thing that was interesting, I saw that 39% of businesses are considering postponing investments. That means that we're already seeing this impact of growth on Canadian businesses. A lot of businesses said they're willing to cut production capacity as well as their workforce. And some are even contemplating moving their operations to the US to circumvent many of these tariff threats. So there is this ongoing uncertainty, this unsettling among the investor, consumer, business community. Economists are talking about potential recession, and many Canadian businesses are asking questions and trying to figure out what are the revenue implications on their own operations in the short term. What extent will this have on the survival of their business in the long term? What should they know? What should they do to prepare? So I am so happy to welcome Bridget LeBlanc-Lapointe, who is a partner specializing in cross-border M&A and venture capital financing. She works at Norton Rose Fulbright, which is a global law firm, and they specialize in key industries, including financial institutions, energy, infrastructure, transport, to name a few. We're going to talk to Bridget to dissect some of these legal implications for businesses when it comes to these US tariffs. Welcome, Bridget.
Thanks so much for having me, Hesse. Maybe I'll start off the bat with a couple caveats. First, I am not a trade lawyer, although I work with some very smart ones. I'm not an economist, and I'm not a fortune teller. But as a corporate transactional lawyer, I've been talking to a lot of founders, their investors, and others in the startup ecosystem about their tariffs related concerns. My second caveat is that this is a highly dynamic situation and we don't have all of the answers. And some of the answers may change along the way. So Hesse, your overview did a fantastic job of underscoring just how much the landscape is evolving. What I'm sharing today shouldn't be construed as legal advice, and businesses should consult with their own legal counsel to get advice that's tailored to their situation. So with those general observations out of the way, let's get started.
Okay, thank you. Very good. And I have to say, Bridget, I have sourced a few lawyers to try to weigh in on this issue, and unfortunately, a lot of them were not able to do so because of the caveats that you had just talked about. I think it's because of the volatility of the situation and the sensitivity of the information. Liability is definitely a concern. So with that being said, let's dive into the questions. Please take into consideration what Bridget has said. And this is generally to provide some advice and guidance to businesses in general, so they understand what they can do with their businesses. So let's start with the first question. What businesses will directly be impacted by tariffs, and how will this be felt in the near term?
Yeah, so let me take a step back and explain what is a tariff. Customs tariffs are a duty applied to goods at the time of importation, depending on the country of origin of the good. So the rate of duty is typically expressed as a percentage of the value of the good and depends on the imported goods customs classification, value, and country of origin. Next, let me unpack who pays a tariff. So in terms of legal liability for payment of duties at the border for imported goods, for imports into the US, typically the importer of the goods, so i.e. the American business, pays the tariffs at the border to US Customs and Border Protection. For goods coming into Canada, the importer, so in this case, the Canadian business, typically pays the duty to Canada Border Services Agency. So with that backdrop, let's get back to your question. In terms of direct impacts of tariffs, businesses in the US that import products of Canada would pay a tariff on those goods, and companies in Canada that import US goods captured by the retaliatory tariffs would pay a tariff on those goods. So of course, that begs the question of what is a good? And for this audience in particular, whether software is captured by the tariffs. With very few exceptions, when the duties briefly came into effect in March, they applied to all tangible goods of Canadian origin that were entered through US Customs for consumption. That order did not appear to cover tangible goods or services, such as the transfer of digital software or other electronic transmission of technical data. That being said, software companies should be mindful about how the software is delivered. For example, physical delivery of software such as on a USB stick or a CD-ROM, if you're going retro, may change the analysis. So as a layperson, I think it's helpful to think of goods in this context as something that is physically crossing a border. The impacts of tariffs will be felt most acutely by Canadian businesses that export Canadian goods to the US and by Canadians that import specified goods originating from the US.
Okay. So we're not talking, tell me whether or not licensing is impacted. Probably not, because it's not considered a physical good.
That's absolutely right. So there's not something that's physically crossing over the border.
Okay. So more broadly, what are the direct or indirect impacts of services and products to consumers who are going to be felt at some point in this cycle by the tariffs, and how will it translate to the economy overall?
Yeah, so tariffs are used to restrict imports by increasing the price of goods purchased from another country, which makes them less attractive to domestic consumers. As I mentioned, when a tariff is imposed, importers pay the tariff to the government. To offset this additional cost, importers typically increase the prices of the goods they sell to retailers or directly to consumers, effectively passing the cost down the supply chain. In some cases, domestic producers may also increase their prices due to reduced competition, leading to higher prices for both imported and domestically produced goods. I think the general expectation from economists is that the looming US tariffs and retaliatory Canadian tariffs will reduce economic growth on both sides of the border and have a negative impact on GDP growth.
You know, one little anecdote about that. I did see in the news the other week about Chapman's ice cream. They're willing to absorb 25 the tariff on their ice cream in order to continue to make it affordable for Canadians. So in some cases, that's great, but they can't do that forever, right?
Yeah.
So so let's talk more about CUSMA, the Canada, U.S., Mexico trade agreement. I purposely said that because that is the official name of this new trade agreement. So the U.S. put a pause on it, and we're expected that this will be lifted on April 2nd. So could you talk about how these tariffs interact with the existing trade agreement under CUSMA? And are there legal avenues to challenge it for potential conflicts?
So many Canadians experts feel that the imposition of new tariffs by the US is a violation of CUSMA, which eliminated tariffs on Canadian origin goods. As I understand it, Canada can challenge this under CUSMA, but the reality is it's going to be a lengthy process, and the remedy available is retaliatory tariffs, which is what Canada is already doing. As an aside, Canada has challenged the US tariffs at the World Trade Organization level as well, which is a separate resolution body than under CUSMA. But again, that process will take time and would likely have a similar result.
Okay, so for Canadian businesses, I guess at this level, can they challenge the new tariffs? Like, I mean, what tools would they have at their disposal?
There isn't a clear path for individual Canadian businesses to mount a legal challenge to the US tariffs, and it would likely be very costly and really impractical to do so. One concrete step Canadian businesses can take is to reevaluate whether the goods imported into the US are truly of Canadian origin, and vice versa for goods imported from the US into Canada. This is going to be a bit technical, but if they conclude that those goods are correctly categorized as being of Canadian or US origin, they can consider whether any changes to the manufacturing process could be made to optimize costs and tariffs. What's interesting is that in the past, companies favored characterizing goods as Canadian origin or US origin so that these could be covered by CUSMA and be free of tariffs. So again, these determinations are quite technical, but it's worth reconsidering that threshold question.
Okay. Okay, so let's get into the business operations, because this is already having effects, as I initially laid out, on the supply chain. And so when it comes to contracts between, let's say, US and Canadian companies, specifically for the Canadian company, what legal recourse do they have if their vendors or partners can't fulfill their obligations because of the tariffs?
I'm going to give you the favorite lawyer answer, which is it depends.
Yes.
But I mentioned earlier that the legal liability for tariffs rests with the importer of a good. This legal obligation to remit duties to the authorities at the border is different from the question of the ultimate liability for customs tariffs as between contracting parties. Contracting parties can determine ultimate liability for customs tariffs as between themselves via contractual provisions. So, for example, the ultimate purchaser of the good in the destination country could agree with the importer that it will reimburse the importer for the import duties as part of the total purchase price of the goods. So businesses should be considering tariff liability based on the wording of their current contracts. Many contracts in place or contracting templates for service and supply agreements were likely created when trade between Canada and the US was much more certain, and most goods were tariff-free or the tariffs were very low. Companies should review existing contracts to see who bears the risk of increased tariffs, if that's even addressed, and identify contractual carve-outs for significant changes like the imposition of tariffs, including by reviewing what we call change of law provisions or force majeure clauses. Listeners may remember the term force majeure from the COVID times. A force majeure clause is a contract in a contract excuses a party from liability or obligation where an extraordinary event beyond their control, like a natural disaster, war, pandemic, prevents them from fulfilling their obligations. If a contract has a force majeure clause, depending on how the provision is drafted, turmoil resulting from the tariff situation may be addressed. Again, absent a contractual agreement to do otherwise, the legal liability for tariffs will rest with the importer of a good.
Got
In
it.
terms in terms of legal recourse, if a party can no longer fulfill its obligations, how that'll play out will again be highly dependent on the contract in question. So businesses should examine their termination rights and the termination rights of their counterparty under their material contracts to determine when, how, and why a contract can be terminated before its stated term.
Okay. So that kind of bleeds into the next question about if companies have to review or renegotiate the supply contracts, what do they have to keep in mind to even just reduce liability to themselves? Because I would assume that, especially if the contract is not set to terminate for, let's say, another year, what can they do to insert, let's say, new clauses into the contract to actually keep them safer?
Yeah. So parties entering into contracts for the supply or delivery of goods, or even businesses reviewing their existing contracts, should pay particular attention to contractual clauses regarding import taxes, duties, and fees, including any references to whether the delivery price is inclusive of all taxes, duties, tariffs, or fees. So this includes terms like delivery duty paid, DDP terms, for example. Businesses may want to consider whether and how supply chains can be diversified. So this will once again depend on their existing supply arrangements and the availability of alternate sources of supply, both either domestically or in countries with which Canada has a free trade agreement. And finally, I'll observe that the ability to renegotiate a supply contract will depend on many factors, which will include how much leverage the renegotiating party has. As a pedantic and lawyerly point, and I'm glad you asked the question, I will remind listeners that amendments to existing contracts should be formalized in the manner set out in the original contract and be drafted in a way that gives parties certainty as to the new bargain.
Okay. Okay. For businesses right now that have to absorb some of the tariff impacts, do you know of any kind of government support programs or remission programs that are available to help them cope with these costs?
In response to the ongoing trade tensions and shifting political dynamics, Canada's federal and provincial governments are rolling out or expanding various support programs and initiatives. These efforts aim to offset the impacts of tariffs and assist businesses and workers in navigating economic uncertainties. So these programs include, the government has indicated that it'll consider various duties relief and requests for remission, which allows for the relief from the payment of tariffs or the refund of tariffs already paid in certain circumstances, if there are exceptional and compelling circumstances. EDC's Trade Impact Program, which will deploy $5 billion over 2 years to help exporters reach new markets and navigate economic challenges such as non-payment, currency fluctuations, cash flow issues, and expansion barriers. BDC's Pivot to Grow program, which will offer $500 million in financial support, advice, and loan deferrals to small and medium-sized businesses with concrete impacts to their financials as a direct of the results of the tariffs. Farm Credit Canada's Trade Disruption Customer Support Program, which offers $1 billion in new financing to support the Canadian agriculture and food industry by addressing cash flow challenges. And finally, we've seen an expanded employment insurance work sharing program, which assists employers in avoiding layoffs when they face temporary decreases in business activities for reasons beyond their control. If the program requirements are met, an employer, employees, and Service Canada enter into a multi-party work sharing agreement under which available work is shared equally among employees, and EI benefits are provided by the federal government as income support to employees who are working reduced hours, which mitigates their income loss.
Okay, Bridget, can you provide like a list, that same list to me, and then we can include it in our show notes for our viewers?
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
So what, from your perspective, are some of the concrete actions that companies can take right now in the face of these risks?
So we've already touched on a lot of these concrete actions, reviewing contractual clauses and considering allocation of tariff liability in future contracts, reevaluating the origin of the goods being exported or imported, considering supply chain diversification. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, businesses should draw on the domestic market and free trade agreements with other regions, like the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, in considering alternate markets for their products and supply sources.
Okay. And I would say look to Canadians interprovincially to actually reduce reliance on even outside markets, because we do have a thriving market in Canada. And it really surprised me, if it weren't for the tariff events, that I didn't realize the extent to which the interprovincial trade was actually a big barrier, even in Canada. So those need to come down. And I think that is going to be a huge GDP opportunity for the country, from what I've read.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so you have like a strong background in venture capital. And I think for our audience, a lot of them are startup ventures. And I'd like to ask, I guess, you, based on your expertise, your opinion on the state of venture capital in Canada right now, and what your advice would be for startup companies who are living in these uncertain times.
So you touched on the fact that businesses are considering postponing key investments, and this might include mergers and acquisitions. First, let me deliver a glimmer of hope. So rest assured, both VC financings and M&A deals are still happening. As I've discussed, not all businesses are directly impacted by tariffs. So for example, businesses that are services-based, deliver software digitally, have low US exposure, or have pricing power should really have less direct exposure to tariffs and remain attractive targets for investment or acquisition. That being said, at a macro level, economic turbulence makes business valuation, deal uncertainty, and in the case of M&A, deal financing trickier. And this generally leaves acquirers and investors with two alternatives to manage the risk. Either introduce deal structure and related protections, or simply wait to see how things play out. Of course, us deal makers have been excited for a robust deal flow in 2025 after seeing a lot of potential sellers sitting on the sidelines. So this is disappointing for everyone. Maybe I'll unpack the risk mitigation tools. So in M&A, sellers can expect different deal structures, as I mentioned, and this can include things like earnouts, rollover equity, and deferred payments. And this is because buyers are looking to reduce financial risk in uncertain economic times. In certain circumstances, deals may also be structured as asset sales, where buyers can pick and choose what they're buying rather than share sales, where a whole company is bought. Sellers can also expect there will be more emphasis, and this is also startups taking an investment, that there's going to be more emphasis on due diligence as buyers or investors seek to mitigate any impact on investment returns. Buyers and investors will be seeking more financial and operational certainty. So deals will take longer to close as buyers and investors balance the need for some degree of certainty against losing a good deal. Remember that in times of uncertainty, deals still happen. There's a buyer's market and an opportunity for sellers as well. So valuations may become more attractive for acquirers. A lower Canadian dollar against the US dollar means that Canadian companies may be more attractive targets. Sellers may consider divesting themselves of non-core assets or those that are most affected by US tariffs. And some Canadian companies may look to establish manufacturing facilities in the US and vice versa, which may happen by way of strategic acquisition. Maybe I'll add a word of caution for businesses looking to foreign investors or acquirers. On March 5th, then Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry announced in a statement posted on X that Canada's economic security is national security. The Investment Canada Act guidelines relating to national security review have also been updated to expressly include the potential of an investment to undermine Canada's economic security by enhancing integration of the target Canadian business with a foreign economy. So that statement and change to the guidelines give an indication that foreign investments may draw heightened scrutiny under the Investment Canada Act by addressing whether they cause injury to Canada's economic security. Finally, I will, just say that these are turbulent times, but sometimes turbulent times have unexpected outcomes. So we all saw the tech sector investment boom, M&A activity in 2021, which at the outset of COVID, I don't know that anyone would have predicted that. And so businesses can really think about the strength of their numbers, think about their strengths, prepare for investment, prepare for due diligence to get ahead of some of these issues.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that is great advice for a lot of startup companies who are already feeling a little bit of a pinch this year and realizing that, they can't even move their businesses ahead even incrementally because of all the issues surrounding the tariffs. Okay, so one last question. Do you hear some main concerns from the business community that you and I haven't yet discussed? Is this uncertainty actually causing a lot more anxiety than we thought?
Yeah, so we've covered a lot of ground, and I am hearing a lot of anxiety and general concern from, like I said, founders, investors, acquirers, targets. Maybe I'll touch on one last topic. So we've been fielding a lot of questions about the interplay between various tariffs and if those tariffs will be calculated in addition to the general 25% tariff. In early February, President Trump announced his intent to impose and directed the various executive agencies to investigate broad-based reciprocal tariffs that would match either the value or the impact of any tariffs or trade measures put in place by other countries on US products. So these reciprocal tariffs would apply to all US trading partners, which would include Canada. These tariffs are still under investigation, though the Trump administration has repeatedly stated that such tariffs could be imposed as soon as April 2nd. So we're going to need to wait to see what is proposed on that front and how these additional tariffs may interact with the impending general 25% tariff.
Thank you so much. There's so much more I want to ask you, but I think at this point, April 2nd is around the corner, and we're going to just wait and see what's going to happen. And I'm sure our government will be ready with full force. Thank you so much, Bridget, for joining us today.
And maybe I'll
impacting. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, so maybe I'm going to end with a shout out to my trade law colleagues who have been publishing insightful and timely thought leadership on all things tariffs, which can be found on my firm's International Trade Hub. But beyond that, it has been such a pleasure discussing these complex matters with you. So thanks so much for making the time.
No problem. What we'll probably do is I will gather some of those links from you, from your website, and provide it as extra resources for our audience. All right.
Fantastic.
Thank you. And so for our audience, if you have topics you want us to explore, please email us at communications@altitudeaccelerator.ca. Just so you know, Tech Uncensored, we've been around for a while. And, I think this is our 80th episode, which is kind of cool. But just so you know, we have a lot more ways to go. So we are powered and produced by Altitude Accelerator. We're hosted on Spotify. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Hessie Jones, and this is Tech Uncensored. Please stay curious and be inspired.